She warned me I'd regret it. I replied, only if you stop. What started as a neighborly tease became something neither of us expected. The late afternoon sun slanted softly over the small residential street, painting the walls of the apartment buildings with warm golden light. I had just stepped out onto my balcony, watering the few plants I'd managed to nurture despite my admittedly erratic green thumb. The smell of damp soil mixed with the faint aroma of blooming jasmine from the next balcony over. It was one of those quiet moments where the world feels paused, like the perfect breath before something begins. From across the narrow courtyard, I noticed her, my neighbor, effortlessly moving among her roses. She was older than me by a decade or more, maybe 42, yet she carried herself with a graceful confidence that made her seem untouchable. Every motion was deliberate but natural. She brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, bending over to check the delicate petals, and for a moment, the sunlight caught her hair in a halo-like glow. Our eyes met briefly when she noticed me fumbling with my watering can. I gave a small, awkward wave, unsure whether to smile or look away. She smiled back, not a polite nod, but a smile that suggested curiosity, amusement, even challenge. Something in her expression was both inviting and unreadable. It made my pulse quicken, though I told myself it was just the surprise of seeing her. She leaned lightly on the fence separating our apartments and called out, teasing, "Careful with those plants, they might not survive your enthusiastic watering." Her voice was soft yet confident, with a warmth that immediately drew me in. I could hear the subtle lilt of laughter in her words, the kind that made you want to hear more even when you weren't expecting it. I replied, a little more confidently than I felt, "I promise I'm doing my best." Her gaze lingered on me for a fraction longer than necessary, and in that moment, I felt a curious mix of admiration and nervous excitement. The kind of feeling that makes you notice small details you normally wouldn't, the gentle slope of her shoulders, the subtle movement of her hands, the way the sunlight caught her eyes just right. We exchanged a few more light words about the weather, the plants, the quirks of our building. Nothing monumental, yet everything felt charged. That first encounter planted a tiny seed of intrigue, a spark that neither of us could, or would, ignore. There was no rush, no overt flirtation, just the quiet magnetism of two people noticing each other in a shared space, letting a connection form slowly, like sunlight filtering through the leaves. By the time she returned to her roses, I found myself lingering a moment longer at the fence, feeling the faint brush of curiosity and anticipation. That first encounter wasn't about fireworks or declarations, it was about noticing each other, and knowing, deep down, that something quietly significant had begun. A few days after our first encounter, the building's narrow stairwell became the setting for another unexpected meeting. I was struggling with a large, unwieldy package, a box of supplies I had impulsively ordered online, when she appeared at the top of the stairs, casually leaning against the railing as if she had been waiting for me to arrive. The soft echo of our steps against the walls and the faint scent of her perfume immediately put me on edge in the most delightful way. Her eyes widened slightly, amused at the sight of me grappling with the box. "You really think you can manage that all by yourself?" she asked, her tone teasing but not condescending. I felt my face warm, both from the physical effort and the subtle thrill of her attention. As I wrestled with the package, she descended gracefully, her presence magnetic and almost effortless. When she offered to help, our hands brushed over the corner of the box. That brief contact, just a fleeting touch, sent an unexpected shiver up my arm. The physical sensation was simple, almost accidental, yet it carried an undercurrent of tension neither of us could ignore. "Careful," she warned softly, her voice low enough that only I could hear, "or you'll regret this." The words were playful, but there was a spark behind them, a hint of something more. It was both a challenge and an invitation, a subtle test of my courage, and perhaps my audacity. I smiled, feeling an unusual surge of boldness. "Only if you stop," I replied, letting my voice hold just enough confidence to match the fluttering in my chest. She paused, her head tilting slightly as she studied me, lips curving in that enigmatic way that always left me guessing. A small laugh escaped her, light and musical, filling the stairwell with warmth. The rest of the encounter passed in shared effort and light banter. She suggested a better grip, I joked about my hidden strength, and all the while, the air between us seemed charged with a quiet electricity. I noticed details I hadn't before, the way her hands moved with precise elegance, the slight tilt of her shoulder when she laughed, and the way her eyes lingered on mine longer than polite conversation required. When the box was finally secured, and we stepped back to admire our small victory, a comfortable silence settled. It wasn't awkward, it was charged, a subtle acknowledgement of a shared understanding. The encounter ended with a smile, a nod, and the kind of lingering gaze that promises more, a challenge left hanging in the air. That day, the playful warning and my daring reply set the tone for the unspoken rules of our interaction. It wasn't just about helping with a package, it was the beginning of a delicate game of proximity, glances, and small touches, a slow burn tension that neither of us could, or wanted to, ignore. The following Saturday morning, the neighborhood felt lighter somehow, as if the world had slowed just enough for moments like this to exist. I found myself at the small cafe a few blocks from our building, a place I had passed countless times but never entered. She was there already, sitting at a corner table bathed in sunlight that filtered through the windows, reading a newspaper and stirring her coffee with deliberate calm. As I approached, our eyes met, and I noticed a small, almost imperceptible smile tug at the corner of her lips. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, an unspoken invitation that made my chest tighten with anticipation. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint fragrance of her perfume, warm, comforting, slightly floral, and I realized how deeply attuned I had already become to her presence. Our conversation started casually, touching on trivial matters at first, the weather, the cafe's pastries, the small quirks of our neighborhood. But slowly, it shifted, as conversations do when two people feel an unspoken trust. She spoke of her work, the challenges and unexpected joys, and I found myself sharing small pieces of my own life, experiences I rarely discussed with anyone. Her laughter was soft, spontaneous, and unself-conscious, and each time it reached me, I felt an unfamiliar ease, as if the walls I often carried around had melted a little. There was a rhythm to our interaction that felt almost choreographed, though entirely natural. When I made a point she found particularly amusing, her hand brushed mine as she reached for her cup, lingering slightly longer than necessary. The warmth of her fingers against mine was subtle, yet electric, and I felt a quiet shiver run up my arm. My pulse quickened, though outwardly I tried to remain composed, masking the effect her presence had on me. Between shared smiles and thoughtful pauses, I noticed the depth behind her gaze, the layers of experience, wisdom, and vulnerability she carried with such effortless poise. It made me acutely aware of the gap between us, not as a barrier but as a fascinating contrast, her quiet confidence and my tentative curiosity creating a balance neither of us had expected. By the time we parted, the sunlight had shifted, casting long, golden shadows across the cafe floor. As she waved goodbye, I lingered a moment longer at the doorway, replaying every nuance, the warmth of her glance, the faint scent of her perfume, the delicate way her fingers had brushed mine. It was in these shared spaces, in these quiet, seemingly ordinary moments, that the connection between us began to deepen, layer by layer, touch by touch, glance by glance. That morning wasn't about grand gestures or confessions, it was about noticing each other fully, quietly weaving trust, admiration, and subtle desire into the fabric of everyday life. And in that gentle unfolding, I realized how compellingly, irrevocably, she had begun to occupy my mind. The moment I closed my apartment door behind me, the quiet of the evening felt almost oppressive. Outside, the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog were the only reminders that the world continued, but inside, my thoughts spun in relentless circles. Her laughter, her smile, the gentle brush of her fingers against mine at the cafe, it all replayed with uncanny clarity. Every detail, from the sunlight catching her hair to the soft scent of her perfume, was etched into my mind. I sank into my chair and ran a hand over my face, trying to shake off the mix of excitement and unease that seemed to have settled deep in my chest. It wasn't just attraction, it was the weight of what I knew to be unconventional, the knowledge that the world might judge the connection forming between me and my neighbor. She was older, experienced, a woman whose life had already carved lines of wisdom and resilience. And yet, here I was, 24, still learning the subtleties of adulthood, feeling inexplicably drawn to her in ways that scared and thrilled me simultaneously. Every time I recalled our shared smiles, the way her gaze lingered just a second too long, or the warmth of her touch, I felt a thrill tempered by hesitation. Was I imagining significance where there was none? Were these moments simply kindness, curiosity, or something more? And if it was something more, did I dare act on it? My own self-doubt became a quiet, persistent voice, questioning my right to be a part of her life beyond casual interactions. I caught myself replaying a particular moment in my mind, her subtle glance of concern when I joked too loudly at the cafe, or the way she'd watched me wrestle with that package in the stairwell, her eyes a mixture of amusement and caution. It struck me that she might have noticed more than I realized, that she was perhaps aware of the tension between us, and yet she had never crossed any overt boundary. That thought both reassured me and terrified me. Sitting there, I realized that part of the slow-burn tension wasn't just about our proximity, it was about restraint, about understanding that connection and attraction aren't merely physical. It was about navigating emotions with care, recognizing vulnerability, and respecting boundaries. And still, despite my hesitation, I could feel the undeniable pull toward her, subtle and insistent, like gravity I couldn't ignore. By the end of the evening, the struggle wasn't resolved, it was only sharpened. I knew I wanted to see her again, to hear her laugh, to share moments, and yet I also feared the social and emotional consequences of crossing unspoken lines. And in that quiet internal tug-of-war, I understood that this slow, careful dance, full of tension, uncertainty, and anticipation, was just beginning. The rain began softly, a rhythmic patter against the windows that made the evening feel cocooned, almost private. I hadn't expected to see her, yet as I returned from a quick errand, there she was, struggling with a small mishap in her apartment. A leaking faucet had turned into a miniature flood on the kitchen floor, and her usual composed demeanor was replaced by a subtle frustration. Seeing her there, sleeves rolled up and hands damp from water, I felt an instinctive pull toward helping. I stepped inside, offering a hand and a few practical suggestions, and she welcomed it without hesitation. The air between us was thick with the scent of rain and warm wood, mingling with the faint trace of her perfume that clung to her hair. Every detail felt heightened, the gentle flick of her wrist as she adjusted the faucet, the slight tilt of her head as she listened, the quiet focus in her eyes. When my hand brushed hers while tightening a loose pipe, I felt a shiver of awareness run through me. It was a simple touch, but the lingering warmth, the unexpected electricity, made me acutely conscious of her presence. Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and in that silent exchange, I felt a shared acknowledgement. We were both aware of the unspoken tension that had been building between us. As the immediate crisis passed, she leaned against the counter, letting out a quiet sigh, and I noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her expression, an openness she rarely showed. I offered a comforting smile, and she laughed softly, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "Thanks for this," she said quietly, her voice lower than usual, more intimate. "I didn't expect help like this." Her words lingered in the room like a soft echo, and I realized that what had begun as a small act of assistance had shifted into something deeper, a moment of mutual trust. She allowed me into her space, both physically and emotionally, and I found myself listening intently as she spoke about small frustrations, fleeting insecurities, and the subtle burdens she carried. In turn, I shared pieces of my own life I rarely revealed, surprising myself with how easily the words flowed. By the time the rain had slowed to a drizzle, we found ourselves standing closer than necessary, her hand resting lightly on my arm as if anchoring the moment. The intimacy was gentle, unspoken, yet undeniably charged. No words could capture the depth of connection forming, an unhurried, slow-burn bond built on vulnerability, shared presence, and small, meaningful touches. That night, I left her apartment with a sense of quiet exhilaration. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions, it was about noticing each other fully, allowing the small sparks of trust and affection to ignite naturally. And in that lingering, tender closeness, I realized the tension between us was no longer just curiosity, it had begun to transform into something profoundly intimate, emotional, and quietly magnetic. The city lights flickered softly beneath the balcony as I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I wasn't sure why I had come here, perhaps it was the need to think, or perhaps it was the hope of seeing her. She was already there, leaning against the railing, her silhouette outlined by the glow of distant street lamps. The sight of her made my pulse quicken, not from panic, but from something deeper, a quiet, insistent longing that I had tried and failed to ignore. She turned slightly as I approached, and our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the city seemed to fade into a soft murmur, leaving just the two of us suspended in the delicate tension between words unsaid and feelings unacknowledged. There was no need for conversation, the silence was its own language, heavy with anticipation and the unspoken weight of what had been building between us. Her hair, caught by the breeze, brushed against her cheek, and I found myself wanting to reach out, to tuck it behind her ear, but hesitation held me back. Instead, my gaze lingered on the curve of her shoulders, the subtle tilt of her head, the way the light played across her eyes. Everything about her seemed impossibly close yet just out of reach. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely more than a whisper. "It's quiet tonight." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, softening the tension while deepening it simultaneously. "Yes," she replied, her tone light yet intimate, but some silences are more comfortable than words. Without realizing it, our hands found each other, fingers intertwining naturally. The touch was electric, not in a flashy, overwhelming way, but quietly intense, a spark that traveled through my chest and settled into a steady, insistent warmth. Her thumb brushed against the back of my hand, slow, deliberate, and I felt a shiver of awareness ripple through me. It was in that simple contact that the depth of our connection revealed itself, a blend of desire, trust, and understanding that had been accumulating in every glance, every touch, every shared laugh. We stood like that for a long moment, the city lights flickering around us, the cool breeze mingling with the warmth between our hands. No words were necessary, everything had been said in gestures, in pauses, in the quiet acknowledgement of the pull neither of us could resist. I realized then that the slow-burn tension, the hesitation, the curiosity, the small touches, had culminated in a profound, undeniable connection. By the time the night deepened, I understood something essential: this wasn't a fleeting attraction or a momentary fascination. It was a deep, resonant bond, a silent desire tempered by respect and emotional intimacy. And in that shared, quiet closeness, I finally understood just how much I wanted her, and how completely she had begun to occupy my thoughts, my senses, and my heart. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the leaves of the shared garden, casting dappled patterns on the cobblestone path. Dew clung to the petals of flowers, sparkling faintly in the light, and the air was filled with the soft, comforting sense of earth and blooms. I arrived early, carrying a small watering can, only to find her already tending to her roses, the faintest smile playing on her lips as she noticed me. There was a calmness in the garden that mirrored the steadiness I felt inside, a quiet acceptance that everything had finally found its rhythm. No rush, no pressure, just the natural flow of presence and attention. As I stepped closer, she looked up and gave me a gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the connection we had nurtured over weeks of subtle glances, shared spaces, and lingering touches. Our conversation was easy, light, and intimate all at once. We spoke about the flowers, about small plans for the day, about trivial things that somehow felt significant because we shared them. And yet, beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding, a warmth in the way our shoulders brushed as we moved side by side, the quiet thrill of fingers occasionally grazing, and the comfort in knowing that neither of us needed to fill every pause with words. At one point, she reached out almost casually, placing her hand on my back as we leaned toward a low branch together, guiding my movements as we trimmed a rose bush. The contact was brief, understated, yet it carried all the weight of weeks of slow, careful intimacy, trust, desire, and quiet affection wrapped into a single gesture. My heart responded in kind, steady and certain, and I realized how much I had come to rely on these small, meaningful touches. When we paused, she turned to me, and her eyes met mine with a clarity that left nothing unsaid. There was no hesitation now, no need for playful banter or teasing challenges. Instead, there was the simple, profound acknowledgement of a bond that had grown naturally, patiently, and undeniably. I stepped closer, and she leaned in, a soft smile gracing her face, and our foreheads met lightly, a delicate, intimate connection that spoke of comfort, safety, and shared joy. Finally, as the morning deepened and the garden basked in full sunlight, she brushed her cheek against mine, a fleeting kiss that lingered long enough to imprint warmth and certainty in my memory. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was steady, gentle, and deeply human. In that quiet, tender moment, the slow-burn tension of weeks resolved into a warm, fulfilling union, two people who had navigated hesitation, desire, and vulnerability to arrive at a connection that was respectful, intimate, and profoundly satisfying. We stayed in the garden, side by side, hands occasionally brushing, sharing smiles and soft words. There was no need for promises, no need for declarations, the bond was clear, complete, and beautifully natural. It was the perfect ending, a gentle affirmation that our slow, careful dance had reached a place of emotional harmony, and that the connection we had built, piece by piece, was ours to cherish. If you felt the slow-burn tension, the quiet longing, or the tender moments between them, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a connection that slowly grew into something unforgettable? And make sure to click the bell so you never miss a story that touches the heart.